We set? Great.
I believe we are live, yes.
Well, good morning to all attending the RTA's meeting of the Board of Directors. Before we begin the meeting, I want to go through our guidelines as I always do. For the members who are in person, turn your microphones on when you wish to speak and off when you are finished so that we limit the microphone chatter to one at a time. I will call on those with questions or comments for those who are here in the room attending in person. For the couple of you who are calling in remotely, please keep your audio on mute as much as possible to minimize the background noise, which will impair the recording of this meeting. And when you have a question or comment, I think you've gotten good at it over the years. Please raise your virtual hand and the board secretary will call on board members who have raised their hands one at a time. When she calls on you, lower your hand and unmute yourself if you can remember before speaking. If not, we'll let you know we can't hear you. With that said, I will now call the meeting of the Board of Directors of the Regional Transportation Authority to order. And will everybody please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands one nation under God. Thank you. Always like that. Makes me feel like I'm back in school. Will the secretary, Kendra, will you please call the roll?
Sure. Okay. Director Andalcio?
Here.
Director Carey?
Here.
Director Colson?
Here.
Director Fuentes?
Here.
Director Gaving? Here. Director Gorman?
Here.
Director Groven?
Here.
Director Holt? Director Cotel? Director Lewis? Director Melvin? Director Pang?
Yes.
Director Ross? Dr. Sager?
Here.
Chairman Dillard?
Here, present.
Okay, we have 9 present, 4 absent, and 2 online.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Item 3 is the approval of the minutes from the board meeting held on August 17th of 2023. Any comments or corrections on those minutes? If not, how about a motion in a second? Motion by Director Andalcio, seconded by Director Dr. Sager. Secretary, Madam Secretary, please take a roll call on the minutes from last month.
Sure thing. Director Andalcio?
Aye.
Director Carey?
Aye.
Director Colson?
Yes.
Director Fuentes?
Aye.
Director Gaving?
Aye.
Director Gorman?
Aye.
Director Groven?
Aye.
Director Pang?
Yes.
Director Ross?
Yes.
Dr. Sager?
Yes. And I'm an aye.
Oh, Chairman Dillard, sorry about that.
The minutes are approved from August 17th of 2023. Item 4 is the public comment segment of the meeting. Any comments received will now be read into the record by the board secretary. Kendra, did we receive any comments?
We did not receive any comments prior.
All right. And is there anybody present who wishes to speak today? Seeing no one, we will move on to the executive director's report. Item 5, Leanne, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. And just for the record, Director Melvin has joined us.
Yes,
as well.
please add
We'll add
Director
him
Melvin
to the
to
roll
the
call.
roll.
But thank you, Chairman Dillard and members of the board and some guests that we have with us today. As a reminder, I think actually I don't have to remind you, it's been less than a month since we met last. And that's because of our legislative and budgetary schedule that we have to have, which is why this meeting sometimes for people feels a little off schedule. But because you took care of all business last month, we don't have the financial budget marks to approve today because you did it already. But we've still been pretty busy in this past like 3 and bit weeks since we last met. You're going to hear more about some of the stuff that staff have been working on and some extensive outreach to key stakeholders in a little bit as they come up in their reports. But I just wanted to, so I'm going to be fairly brief. Yesterday, I attended the special joint session of the CMAP board and the MPO policy board over at the old post office, where their staff presented the draft plan of action for regional transit, or the PART plan as it's referred to. CMAP and the MPO will meet again in October to actually vote on that plan. And at the end of today's meeting, we have Erin and Laura from CMAP to make a presentation to you, and we'll answer your questions and take any comments that you might have. So next slide, please. This month's legislative update, just wanted to mention a couple of things that don't fall into or under the category of all things strategic plan implementation, since you're going to hear about those a little bit later in the agenda. But there's been some news coverage on the Federal Transit Administration announcing that CTA's Red Line Extension project has advanced to the next phase of the New Starts program, which allows the CTA to really begin their engineering phases in earnest on that project. And the approval represents a really big milestone that Dorval and his team have been working very hard on for years, and fundamentally means securing the grant funding for the program, and puts the project on track to receive a grant award of an estimated $1.973 billion. Sorry, wrong letter. $1 billion by the end of 2024. So that project, a long time coming, is finally hitting that key milestone. In addition, on the federal front, the RTA recently worked with the Illinois Public Transit Association, which is our statewide association, and our downstate colleagues on a letter to the US House delegation raising concerns about the chambers, the congressional federal US Chambers concerns about their proposed cuts to transit funding. As I mentioned actually in my report last month, the House and the Senate appropriates marked up and approved the FY 2024 appropriation bills for transportation, housing, and urban development. And while the Senate's version appropriates public funding levels at the levels of the IIJA, which is the last transportation bill, the House proposes to cut funding to transit by about 13%. So that's a significant number. And though I will point out, though, that the budget negotiations are going to continue into the fall, as we're sort of facing either a continuing resolution or hopefully a budget approval. So we will keep working with our delegation on, they're up to speed, but we'll keep working with them to make that point across the House side of membership. And as I mentioned, CMAP is also approved their draft recommendation of projects for the what we call CMAC, which is the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, as well as the Carbon Reduction Program, or the CRP funding. The list includes 5 projects submitted by the RTA, CTA, Metro, and PACE, totaling more than $350 million in federal funds. The projects include vehicle and locomotive electrification, CTA's Red Line extension, some work in that space as well, PACE's Pulse Holstead line, and the RTA's access to transit projects. So that was some good news getting those funds. An additional $23 million was recommended for municipal partners for a combination of CTA and metro station improvements. And the recommended program is going to be incorporated into the Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP as we refer to it, because we love our acronyms, for that amendment and consideration at the October joint meeting, second joint meeting of the CMAP board and the MPO policy committee, which is actually just their normal regular board. So next slide, please. Just really quickly on today's agenda, we will begin with our regular update on Transit is the Answer implementation work. Following that, we're going to ask you for a vote on an amendment to the 2023-27 capital program, as well as an ordinance approving funding for this year's 5310 projects. In that presentation, you'll hear a little bit more detail about the 13 projects that we have that really fundamentally support enhanced mobility for seniors and people with disabilities across our region, and ultimately helps us meet the goals within our human services transportation plan that we put together with a lot of stakeholders across the region. After that, we'll ask for your vote on an ordinance approving the RTA's Title VI plan, and then 2 contract approvals for consultants with help on one being a corridor study, and the second being some additional economic impact analysis work that we are doing that will supplement our strategic plan implementation, and as importantly, our ongoing conversation with stakeholders in the legislature around the benefits and the impacts and the value of transit. As I mentioned earlier, we will conclude with a presentation from CMAP on their recently released draft plan of action for regional transit. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will turn it back to you or answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for Leanne? All right, we will move on. Thank you, Leanne. We'll move on to item 6A, and that's an update on transit is the answer strategic plan. Rob Nash will lead us off, and Rob, you can introduce the staff and move it along as you see fit. Morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. We will hand it off as we move through the process here. Good morning. I am Rob Nash, Director of Government Affairs here at the RTA. As part of the legislative update, I'm first going to talk about some of our outreach to legislators in the region, and then discuss the implementation timeline for the last session's transit omnibus legislation. We touched on this last meeting, but wanted to give you an update on some specific timing on deliverables for that. I will then pass it over to Michael for more mobility services implementation of a new fare program included in that omnibus package. And following the legislative update, there'll be a discussion of budget and new RTA performance measures and some dashboards that we are rolling out. Next slide, please. The Government Affairs team continues to conduct outreach to members of the Illinois General Assembly to discuss both the fiscal cliff and transit is the answer, as well as RTA's implementation of relevant legislation passed last session. Today, we've met with about 29 legislators over that period since the adjournment of session at the mid to latter part of May, including leadership in both chambers, as well as meetings with the governor's office. Meeting priorities include members of relevant committees, as well as members that have an interest in continued advocacy on behalf of the system. The outreach will continue as we look to veto session scheduled for the last week of October, and then again in early November, and the beginning of a new legislative session in January of 24. A few quick updates on implementation of the omnibus legislation from last session before I pass this along to Michael to discuss some specifics around the domestic violence and sexual assault RTA public transportation assistance program. RTA staff has completed a searchable map of businesses within a 1 mile radius of fixed route transit as detailed in Public Act 103-291. This is the expansion of the transportation benefits program, pre-tax dollars for riders to utilize on transit. Staff has distributed social media toolkits to lawmakers in the General Assembly and other partners in the private sector to promote the availability of the program, both to encourage employees to sign up, but also to encourage businesses to engage with their payroll departments or internal staff to make sure this is set up and offered to employees as a benefit. We have also taken a little bit more time to emphasize that this is not just tax savings for the employees, but a significant benefit for the employers on the payroll tax side. We'll continue to push enrollment in the program to make paying for transit easier and more affordable. And it was an important part of the implementation or the omnibus legislation. And we continue to keep lawmakers informed as we roll these items out. Other items, I'm sorry, on the omnibus side, staff's going to work scoping on the report on fare equity and the impacts of free and reduced fares on the system. The report's due to the General Assembly in July of 24, so we do have some time on that. This will be informed and help us develop, I think, other programs that could enhance and expand those programs. So that's important work that we are in the midst of currently. And then we're working with our partners at the service boards to ensure that they're meeting other new requirements and lending some technical assistance where necessary. Specifically, we're coordinating some youth jobs and internship programs with Metro and PACE that were outlined in the legislation, sort of an enhancement and extension of some of the opportunities for youth jobs that CTA has been a little bit more engaged with through the mayor's office and longstanding program across multiple administrations there. And then monthly data reporting on service staffing and system safety for CTA, Metro, and PACE another request of the legislature to update on performance metrics and measuring progress on those items. Finally, the government affairs staff continues to provide support to the mobility services team as we approach the rollout of the new fare program, which Michael will describe next.
All right, thanks, Rob. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Vandekreek, the Director of the Mobility Services Department. As Rob just reported, we've been working with the network advocating against domestic violence to implement a new domestic violence and sexual assault RTA public transportation assistance program. The legislation contained three components. First, that the RTA will provide 25,000 fare permits preloaded with $20 each to the network for distribution to their member domestic violence service organizations. Two, the RTA will provide a position on our Citizens Advisory Board for a representative from the network. And three, the RTA will provide a report to the General Assembly annually on the utilization and effectiveness of the program. We're happy to say that the program will be fully operational by the implementation deadline of October 20th. The planning for this program was a successful joint effort of Mobility Services, Government Affairs, the network, CTA, and Cubic. So the network advocating against domestic violence is a group of over 40 member organizations dedicated to improving the lives of those impacted by domestic violence through education, public policy, advocacy, and connecting community members with direct service providers. While there are member organizations that are throughout Northern Illinois, only the organizations within our 6-county region will receive this transit benefit. As you know, the Mobility Services Department determines eligibility for the RTA's reduced fare and ride-free programs, so it's a natural fit to house this new program within the department. Currently, we purchase blank Ventura card stock through an IGA with CTA for our reduced fare and ride-free programs. However, this new program requires us to purchase general use Ventura card stock that we can add funds to, which is a different card stock than we currently purchase from CTA. So the first step we need to take to launch this program was that we had to amend an IGA we have with CTA to allow us to purchase this new card stock. In addition, we'll pay CTA to preload each of the 25,000 permits at $20 for a total of approximately $532,000, which includes processing fees and mailing expenses. Concurrently to the work with CTA and the IGA amendment, we have been meeting with the network to determine the process for distribution of these permits and to determine who will serve on the RTA cab representing the network. It was determined that the RTA will provide all 25,000 permits to the network in one shipment on or before October 20th. And those permits, once they're received by the network, the funds will be added on the back end. The network will then distribute these permits to their member organizations through throughout the RTA service area proportionately based on the average number of clients each organization served in 2021 and 2022. The network will be responsible for tracking and reporting out on the total number of permits provided to each agency. Lastly, the network appointed Lauren Gutierrez as a representative on the RTA's Citizens Advisory Board. Lauren is the managing attorney of the Safety and Family Practice Group at the Legal Aid Society of Metropolitan Family Services. Her primary role in the CAB will be to submit a report to the RTA on the distribution of the permits, participants' testimonies on the program's impacts, and any recommendations on improved implementation. The RTA is then required to report this information to the General Assembly each year. This concludes my portion of the update, but before we move on to Doug Anderson, who will provide a financial update, I'll pause here to ask if there's any questions about the legislative update or the implementation of this new fare program.
Director Ross.
Does the network have a website so that we could see who the member agencies are?
Yes, they do, and I can get that to you.
Thank you.
Question. Director Carey, good morning.
Michael, you might have said this and I apologize, but it's only CTA cards? Maybe.
No, these are going to be general use Ventura cards, so they can be used
general
on
use, okay.
CTA pace,
Okay.
and then if they want
Oh,
to,
you're
they
just
can.
CTA stock. That's what.
Yeah,
you're-
the regular
okay.
Ventura stock.
Okay.
Yep. cards.
And if an organization is not in the network, they're not part of it. Was the
That's-
network part of the legislation or did we? Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. So they'll get
Interesting.
all the permits and then they'll only give them out to their member networks or
Okay.
their member organizations in this region.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
All right, thank you. I'll turn it over to Doug.
Good morning, everyone. Doug Anderson, Manager of Budget and Analysis here at the RTA. For information only this month, I'll provide a brief update on the Service Board financial results through July. The operating deficit results continue to be very favorable to budget for each service board and the region as a whole. Next slide, please. CTA, Metra, and PACE system-generated revenue was favorable to budget, and each service board's operating expenses were significantly lower than budgeted. A total of about $78 million of favorable expense variance was driven primarily by labor savings, as each service board continues to carry unfilled positions. Next slide, please. Since the last update, the service boards have requisitioned an additional $111 million in relief funding. And as a region, we have now drawn down over half of the $3.5 billion total. Notably, PACE did draw down the balance of the remaining American Rescue Plan Act funds for suburban service and the balance of their CRISA funds for ADA paratransit with their 2022 closeout. So they've now requisitioned 100% of their relief funding. CTA and Metra continue to utilize a draw-as-you-go approach, as we discussed last month, while PACE will hold their relief funds in reserve until needed. We still anticipate that federal relief funds will begin to exhaust around the end of 2025, but the proposed service board budgets to be released in October should provide a refined estimate of that date. I'll pause here for any questions on finance before turning things over to Peter Farnwell to discuss performance measures.
Any questions, Doug? Great. Peter, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Again, I'm Peter Farnwell, Manager of Strategic and Corridor Planning, and I'll be providing an update on our new dashboards for our performance measures program. Next slide. So back in May, I shared two performance dashboards that provide key information useful to decision makers such as the board, as well as making the information available to all our stakeholders in a timely and transparent fashion. The first was the State of Transit dashboard shown here, which includes two panels relating to service and two relating to financial information for the most recent month. Next slide. And then the second dashboard was shown here, that the dashboard displays a variety of metrics and results that have been historically presented at board meetings every month. So these two dashboards continue to be available on the RTA website. And today I'm pleased to share three new dashboards, which have been designed to measure our progress on implementation of transit is the answer. Next slide. These new dashboards track strategic performance measures for the three outcomes related to the transit system as identified in Transit is the Answer. These outcomes center around the user experience, progress made in maintaining the transit infrastructure, and how well RTA and the service boards are maximizing the use of our shared resources. And the three new dashboards are linked from the new Transit is the Answer website. Next slide. I'll first provide a bit of detail on the safe, accessible, reliable, and useful dashboard. This shows details on ridership, average speed, safety and security events, passenger trips per vehicle hour, and vehicle service miles per square mile of the service area. And all three of the new dashboards will include a panel on the left that includes definitions of each metric. And by default, results will display with the system as a whole. But viewers may use the selector tool at the top to choose service board specific results. And the small arrows in the bottom left corner indicate where a user can download the corresponding data set. Where available, we will be showing year-to-date results compared with the 4 previous years' annual totals. And generally, the data for each of the new dashboard pages will be updated monthly, although some metrics may be available only quarterly and even a few annually. We are showing several measures on these dashboards, as no single measure can really tell the whole story. And I'll go briefly through each of the panels for this dashboard. Next slide. The ridership metric is shown here. System-wide results are shown here. Years 2019 to 2022 include, again, the full years of data, while the final bar for this year of 2023 shows our year-to-date ridership, which right now includes trips through July. And through July, ridership exceeds 183 million passenger trips, and each month of 2023 has had ridership improvement compared to corresponding months of 2022. And we are on track for this year to exceed last year's ridership. Next slide. Transit system safe, accessible, reliable, and useful. This chart shows average speed, and again, the system-wide average is shown here, but user could select an individual mode. But you can see the average speed has been very consistent throughout the 5 years, about 15 miles per hour. Next slide. And the panel shows a measure of efficiency, which is passenger trips per vehicle revenue hour. The 17% increase in passenger trips in 2023 so far has resulted in improved efficiencies. And on the system-wide average, 24 passenger trips are taken for each hour of transit service. Next slide. And in this panel, we can see the number of reportable safety and security incidents per million passenger trips. There was a 15% decline from 3.4 incidents in 2020 and 2021 to 2.9 incidents in 2022. However, the results is still significantly higher compared to the 1.8 incidents reported in 2019. This data is from the FTA's National Transit Database, which has a lag in reporting these statistics, so accurate year-to-date for 2023 is not yet available. Next slide. The last panel is related to the user experience of service density for the annual vehicle miles of service per square miles of the service area. This is fairly consistent service levels in the years 2020, 2021, and through 2022. Results for 2023 are year-to-date through July. And we have seen a 1.7 increase in vehicle miles over the course of this year so far. So we are also on track to exceed the 2022 levels of service in this year. Next slide, please. And for the next two dashboards, I'll provide a quick overview today and can provide more detail in a future report. For static repair, the metrics include annual capital funding, the capital expenditures, percentage of stations that are ADA accessible, and the miles between major mechanical failures. Next slide. And finally, the transit is the answer. It identified 4 measures of financially stable transit system, shown here, the operating cost per vehicle revenue hour, the average fare, the recovery ratio, and auxiliary revenue. The auxiliary revenue is revenue generated by the service boards beyond fares and public revenues. This includes things such as lease incomes and advertising revenues. And one important thing to note here too is the recovery ratio expresses the ratio of the fare revenue to operating expense. It does not include the credits and exclusions allowed within the statutory recovery ratio, which is shown on the finance dashboard. Next slide. So in terms of next steps, the data within each dashboard will be refreshed as often as possible. Depending on the measure, this may mean monthly, quarterly, or annually. And additional measures outlined within transit is the answer will be added into the mix as staff identifies and executes the process necessary to obtain and present the data. And aside from the three outcomes for the transit system we have covered today, we will be developing performance measures related to the regional outcomes outlined in transit is the answer. And finally, to disseminate an advanced understanding of the data contained within the dashboard, staff will continue to develop blogs and social media content on an ongoing basis. So thank you for your time, and I will be happy to address any comments and questions.
Thank you. It's good stuff. Any questions of Peter? Comments? Director Ross.
Could you just tell us how average speed is calculated and also why that's an important metric for us?
It's let me think about this. It's on it's from the National Transit Database, so it is provided. It's the revenue hours versus the revenue miles, the total of the systems, and it's important, particularly for the bus. CTA bus has seen, although it's a big broad measure, so it doesn't move very fast or rapidly. It's a regional measure and a total system measure. But CTA bus has seen a gradual decline over the years, indicating congestion is increasing travel times by bus, and it supports the bus rapid transit initiatives. Additionally, on the rail side, it could be if slow zones may be showing up as impacting speeds. So it's a level of quality of service. It's important to the riders because it translates to travel time.
Dr. Sager, do you have a question or comment?
I'm almost afraid to say this, so I apologize upfront for saying this. I love the fact that so many people in this room are young, but for me, it's next to impossible to read these things. And I say that with all due respect. You give us a tremendous amount of information. I have all of the faith and the confidence in the world. I listen closely to what you say, but I cannot see these things at all. The charts and everything, they're wonderful, but they're illegible from my perspective. So I say that with respect and appreciation, but it is fact for somebody like me who's getting older.
I will just clarify that the whole design of them is meant to be looking at them on your computer because they're dashboards available to the public. So that's why they don't necessarily lend themselves well to the screens that we're showing you on, and they're live sort of data. As Peter said, you can drill down in them, you can click on any and it'll break out CTA, Metro and Pace within that. So it is a little cumbersome, maybe that's not the right, a little less legible perhaps when we're trying to show, especially when we're showing the overall dashboard, because it's anticipated that you'd be sitting there looking at your computer screen and you can click around and look. We can, duly noted though, and I know that it had been raised once before, we will continue to endeavor to find ways in this format to show.
I understand what you're trying to do, but for me, if you just had the title of what that dashboard is then, but don't try to get all this other stuff up there because you just can't read it. I mean, it's too much. Sure, that would help. But please, I'm only one person.
But noted, thank you.
It is well noted. Director Melvin.
Good stuff. It's great to see it.
Thank you.
Glad it's out there like that. It's great. Thank you. And the mobility services edition is excellent.
I agree.
Great. Rob, anything else from this panel?
No.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. We'll move on to some action items. Item 7A are the ordinances approving the amendment of the 2023 to 2027 capital program and extensions to ICE funded projects. And Brian Lohenberg and Violet Gergel are here to brief the board. Morning.
Good morning. I'm Brian Lohenberg, Manager of Capital Programs, and I'm here to request your approval of two ordinances. First, an amendment to the 2023 to 2027 capital program, and second, changes to the ICE program. Next slide, please. First, let's review the capital program amendment. The funding for the 2023 to 2027 capital program, including changes to approved funding and projects for CTA and PACE. The overall program is increasing by $256 million. CTA's program is increasing by $252 million, and PACE's program is increasing by $4 million. Both service boards are adding a mix of new and reprogrammed funds. Metro's program is not being amended this quarter. Details of all revenue and project changes can be found in the memo and schedules 2A and 2B in your packets. Next slide, please. Our first capital highlight for today is from CTA. CTA received $241 million in discretionary federal grants that we're programming today. The grants include, first, the Rail Vehicle Replacement Program with funds of $200 million to fund CTA's next generation rail cars, $25 million in Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity, or RAISE grant, for the electrification of 95th Street Bus Terminal, $13 million in Department of Homeland Security funds, which is $7 million more than CTA estimated in the originally adopted budget. These funds will pay for security projects, including IT upgrades and detection systems. Finally, CTA received transit infrastructure grants for the following: electrification at Chicago Garage, CTA's all-station accessibility program at Oak Park and Ridgeland Station on Green Line, and an evaluation study to reopen the currently closed Englewood Racine Green Line Station. Next slide, please. Next, for PACE, we wanted to note that PACE continues to program funds towards electrification. PACE received a transit infrastructure grant for electric buses and is reprogramming RTA bonds for bus purchases. Next slide, please. As we continue to share capital highlights in these presentations, we wanted to include an intermediate update from Project Management Oversight Division. They're an integral part of the work that we do in the capital space here at RTA. As a reminder, RTA's capital efforts are involved throughout the process of planning, funding, and constructing capital projects. We start with strategic planning, which helps to determine long-range priorities. Then the capital programming team reviews and budgets upcoming projects in the capital program, which we're amending today. And finally, project management oversight is tasked with overseeing the projects from design to completion. As a reminder, the PMO group provides oversight on all state-funded projects, which includes attending progress meetings, conducting site visits, and providing regular updates to the board. We wanted to highlight some important projects that are currently moving forward with Rebuild Illinois funding. Back in March, the board approved several amendments to Rebuild Illinois funds to ensure that these projects are fully funded. I'll pass the presentation on to Violet Gergel, Division Manager of PMO, to share some of these highlights.
Thanks, Brian. In July, CTA started construction on the Forest Park branch of the Blue Line. This work is part of CTA's phase 1 of the multi-year project to make service along the Blue Line's Forest Park branch faster, safer, more reliable, and accessible for riders. The scope of work under this project includes completely rebuilding the track infrastructure between Illinois Medical District and LaSalle stations, removing almost 3 miles of slow zones. The budget for this project is $158 million, almost $110 million coming from Rebuild Illinois funds. The work is being done in phases. For Part A, service was suspended between LaSalle and Illinois Medical District. Part A was completed on time, and service between those two stations was restored on August 20th. On that same date, service was suspended between UIC Halstead and Illinois Medical District, which is Part B of the project. Once that section of track infrastructure is rebuilt, the service will be restored in early October. CTA is providing free shuttle buses, free rides on select CTA and PACE bus routes, as well as reduced fare on train rides at select stations as alternate options to its customers. The scheduled completion for this project is March 2024. More funding is needed to advance future phases of the Forest Park branch rebuild, which in total is estimated to cost $3 billion. CTA continues to explore funding opportunities to complete this important project. Next slide, please. In June, Metra hosted a groundbreaking ceremony for the 79th, 87th, and 103rd Street stations on the Metra Electric. Chairman Dillard spoke at the event, and Director Lewis, as well as Director Gorman, were also present. The project is part of Metra's Electric Community Initiative, a multi-year, multi-million-dollar plan to transform 13 stations on the line. At the completion of this project, all 3 stations will have enclosed, ADA-accessible, street-level entrances and lobbies with elevators, new stairs at head houses, new composite deck platforms, and new lighting and signage. The budget for this project is $61 million, fully funded by Rebuild Illinois and PAYGO. The construction services for all 3 stations were procured under one contract as part of Metra's effort to be innovative and put some of the risks related to coordination and delays on the contractor. To reduce the impact on customers, the work will be done in stages so that no more than 2 of the stations are closed at one time. The plan outlined in the contract calls for 1 station to be closed and work well underway before work begins on the 2nd station. Once the 1st station is reopened, construction will begin on the 3rd station. The 79th Street station is the first one to undergo construction, and it has been closed on July 10th. The 103rd station will close in November, and 87th Street station is scheduled to close in March 2024. Each station is expected to be closed for about 9 months during construction. All 3 stations are scheduled to be completed by the end of September 2024. As far as progress on 79th Street Station, the contractor demolished existing structures and sidewalks both under the bridge and at platform level. Work is advancing to construction of the staircase as well as excavation for elevator shaft and platform level work. We will keep the board apprised as this important equity and accessibility project advances. Next slide, please. PACE had a groundbreaking ceremony on the new ADA transfer facility in Schaumburg in August. As part of this project, the existing Northwest Transportation Center will become a critical hub for paratransit with new assets that promote accessibility, expand capacity, and enhance comfort and aesthetics for people with disabilities and other commuters. The improvements to the site include the demolition of the former Schaumburg Post Office and the renovation of an existing facility that will accommodate customers for the first time with indoor waiting area and public restrooms. The concept was informed by feedback from PACE's ADA Advisory Committee and reinforces the agency's commitment to advancing the accessibility and equity of its service. The PACE Northwest Transportation Center is a major hub with over 1,000 daily boardings, including I-90 Express buses. The new transit center and ADA transfer facility will include 2 new car charging stations, and parking capacity will increase from 192 spaces to 301 spaces to support the popular I-90 Express services. The budget for this project is $6 million, all of which comes from the Rebuild Illinois funding. The post office building demolition has been completed in July. The project is currently in the permitting phase for construction. The expected completion date is July 2024. At this time, I will pass it back to Brian to wrap up the presentation.
Thanks for that update, Violet. Our second ordinance for review is the request for extensions on ICE-funded projects. Metro is requesting a 1-year extension for 6 ICE-funded projects, which are mobile application development, passenger information displays, platform heating technology, luminous platform signs, LED lighting conversions, and hybrid vehicle purchases. CTA and PACE are not requesting extensions at this time. Next slide, please. To conclude, staff requests adoption of the following ordinances: approval of the amendment to the 2023 to 2027 capital program and approval to changes to the ICE program. As a reminder, no board action is required for the PMO update that Violet provided, as this was for your information only. Violet and I are happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, we're seeking approval of these 2 ordinances.
Any questions or comments on the proposed 2 ordinances? If not, how about a motion and a second that we approve these 2? Director Melvin moves, seconded by Director Carey, that the items in 7A, the 2 ordinances, be approved. With that, let's take a roll call if we could, Madam Secretary.
Sure. Director Andalcio,
Aye.
Director Carey,
Aye.
Director Colson, Director Fuentes,
Aye.
Director Gavin,
Aye.
Director Gorman,
Aye.
Director Groven,
Aye.
Director Melvin,
Yes.
Director Pang,
Yes.
Director Ross,
Yes.
Director Sauger,
Yes.
Chairman Dillard.
Yes. Thank you. And that, those 2 ordinances are approved. Thanks, Violet and Brian, very much. Next is 7B, an ordinance approving the section 5310 enhanced mobility for seniors and individuals with disabilities program of projects. And Heather Mullins is here. Morning, Heather.
Right. Good morning, everyone. My name's Heather Mullins. I'm the division manager of our local planning and program management group here at the RTA. And today we are seeking approval of the FY 2022 and 2023 Section 5310 program of projects. Next slide. So the Section 5310 program is a federal formula grant program that provides assistance to public transportation projects that focus on enhancing mobility for seniors and individuals with disabilities. The RTA became the designated recipient for the Section 5310 program with the Illinois Department of Transportation in 2013. As co-designated recipient of the Section 5310 program, the RTA awards and administers operating, mobility management, and capital improvement projects, while IDOT awards and administers grants for paratransit vehicle purchases. So the RTA only administers the program and passes through federal funding. There's no RTA funding used in this program. Next slide. So project selection for the program is guided by the Coordinated Public Transit Human Service Transportation Plan, or the HSTP, which was updated and adopted by the RTA back in March 2021. So a locally developed HSTP identifies the transportation needs of individuals with disabilities, older adults, and people with low incomes, and provides strategies for meeting those local needs, and prioritizes transportation services and projects for funding and implementation. Next slide. So the HSTP recommended 9 goals and strategies to meet the transportation needs of seniors and people with disabilities. They're listed on this slide. Selected Section 5310 projects must meet at least one of these goals, and several meet more than one. Projects in our recommended program meet goals number 1, which is establish mobility management and travel training networks. Goal number 2, which is expand service areas and hours. And goal number 8, which is to establish a regional one-call, one-click service. Also note that the recommended projects support Invest in Transit by helping to create a fully accessible transit system. Next slide. So this slide has an overview of the timeline for this year's call for projects. The call opened on March 22nd. About 5 weeks later, April 21st, applications were due. In May and June, we gave an opportunity for applicants to present further details on their projects to our project selection team. We then put together our recommended program of project and opened that to a 30-day public comment period. In July through August, we only received a handful of comments, but they were all positive and supported the projects in the recommended program. And we're here before you today to seek approval of the program of projects. Also note that we do conduct a call for projects every other year, and that combines 2 years of funding. So our next call is scheduled to be in 2025. Next slide. So funding for this year's call was higher than previous years due to the increase in funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA. So there was a total of $19.2 million in federal funding from FY 2022 and FY 2023. And that was about $6 million more than what was available during our last call for projects for FY 2021. So of that 19.2 million, 5.5 went to IDOT for their vehicle procurements, and the RTA retained 13.7 million to use for our call for projects for operating mobility management and capital projects. Next slide. So we received 15 applications for a total of $26 million, which means we were over-programmed by about 13 million. Staff is recommending 13 projects listed on both this slide and the following slide. Many of the projects in the recommended program are current Section 5310 subrecipients for operating projects, so they may be familiar to you. Next slide. This is the rest of the list here. So applications are recommended based on eligibility, needed funding, particularly for our returning operating projects, project selection team member scoring and ranking, and that project selection team was made up of representatives from IDOT, CMAP, Easter Seals, and the RTA. Again, there's no RTA funds. This is all federal funding with the subrecipients providing the required local match. We do have several new capital projects in the program this year that I want to point out. There's one for each service board. For Metra, we're providing funding for their ADA visual information signs. For the CTA, we're providing funding for their tactile signage at bus stops. And for PACE, we're providing funding for the ADA paratransit and dial-a-ride elements of their mobility as a service app. And next slide. All right, next steps. So following this meeting, we will officially notify all the applicants of their application status, and then we'll prepare our official application to the FTA, and we expect to have the funding to be able to issue grant agreements with our subrecipients first and second quarter of next year. Next slide. Oh, that was it. Have you taken any questions?
Any questions of Heather? Yes, Director Melvin.
Just quickly, so the service that's being funded for PACE, will it cover ADA as well, or is that a separate thing?
So there's two projects where we awarded funding to PACE for their call centers, which covers all the scheduling for a lot of the Section 5310 operating projects. We're also giving them funding, it's capital funding for their mobility as a service app. PACE does provide, for the majority of the county-led operating projects, they provide the service for those counties. Is that what you're asking? Okay.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, 5310 is such a great program, as Director Fuentes will remind us all the time. All right, if there's no questions, how about a motion in a second? Director Fuentes moves that we approve item 7B, seconded by Director Andalcio. And with that, I don't know if our legal counsel is here. Allison, can we do leave for the attendance roll call or not on this? How about leave for the attendance roll call? Seeing no objection, leaves granted, and this item 7B is approved. Thank you. Item 7C is an ordinance approving the RTA's Title VI plan for 2023 to 2026. Mario, good morning. Friend.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Mario Basurdo. I am the Deputy General Counsel for the RTA. I'm going to be presenting you the Title VI program in a nutshell rather than going through the entire report. But if at any point you have any questions, at any point, please feel free to contact me. As you're probably aware, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 provides that no person in the United States shall on the ground of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program receiving federal assistance. So that's federal money, race, color, or national origin. And this applies to the RTA and any RTA subrecipients, such as the 5310 program Melissa just spoke about, where the money passes through from the RTA to another entity. There are currently 13 of those, and we monitor them to make sure that they also have compliant Title VI programs. The RTA has to submit an updated Title VI report to the FTA for approval every 3 years. The current plan expires on November 30th, 2023. However, it is due 60 days prior to that. There are notice requirements that the RTA is compliant with. The RTA provides public notice and instructions on how to file a complaint, as well as a complaint form with detailed instructions, both on how to file a complaint with the RTA itself, or if they're not comfortable doing that, with directly to the FTA. The notice is posted on the RTA website, the RTA office on the bulletin board, and also at the RTA's ADA certification sites on their bulletin boards. Going to give you some examples of some of the programs. And one of the great things for me in preparing the information for this report was getting to talk to different people about the different programs and finding, the passion that my coworkers have for these programs. The RTA Travel Information Center provides real-time telephone-based language interpretation services in hundreds of languages. Prior to COVID, they're receiving over 1 million calls per day. And, since COVID, ridership's down and those numbers are down. I think that at one point there was a low of 300,000 calls, but this year we're on pace for being over 500,000. So it's trending in the right direction. Translation services are available for all of the programs. The ADA paratransit eligibility determination and appeals, ADA travel training. The RTA website informs the public how to request translation services. For other languages, most things are already in English and Spanish. The RTA also contracts with a firm to translate documents or summaries of the documents when those are requested. There are a couple of reduced fare programs I'd like to highlight. The Ride Free program. Older adults and people with disabilities enrolled in the Illinois Department of Aging's Benefit Access Program are eligible to ride free on the service board's fixed route bus and rail services. There's a reduced fare program. People 65 or older and other qualified individuals with disabilities are eligible for reduced fares. And again, translators are available upon request. The RTA Travel Training Program provides professional one-on-one training for people with disabilities and older adults on how to use the public transportation system. Trainers meet with customers at a location convenient to them, and they practice the skills necessary to use public transit. The program also provides individual and group transit orientation for customers with disabilities and older adults who need orientation to fixed route transit service so they can use it independently. Travel trainers provide instruction in English and Spanish. Instruction in other languages are provided through a telephone-based translation service. Wherever possible, the RTA trip planner on the website uses universal icons and pictographs to bridge language barriers for speakers of other languages. Regional interagency signs intentionally rely on these universal icons and pictographs. System maps themselves are published in English and Spanish. Spanish is the largest non-English language utilized in the region. Since the last submission of the RTA's Title VI program, there was one complaint filed on the complaint form. And upon investigation, I found that it was more of, well, first of all, it wasn't directed at an RTA employee. It was directed at one of the service boards. Secondly, it was not based on race, color, or national origin. It was more of a customer service complaint is essentially what it was. But we take all complaints seriously, so I investigated, and once I found out what it was, I just passed it along to the appropriate service board. There have not been any lawsuits, any Title VI lawsuits naming the RTA since the last submission. And, you know, well, you're aware that we don't interact with the public on the same level as the service boards. But I also attribute that to, as I said, the hard work and passion of my coworkers who take their jobs very seriously and have a passion for this thing. Thank you for your time. We need your approval to submit the program to the FTA. Thank you.
Thank you. Grazie, Mario. Any questions or comments? Thank you, and keep taking it seriously. Director Melvin.
Great presentation.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, with that, I guess we do need a, we do need a motion and a second here. Director Pang moves, seconded by Director Ross, that we approve item 7C, the ordinance approving the RTA's Title VI plan for the next 3 years. With that, is there leave for the attendance roll call? Seeing no objection, leave is granted, and Mario, the ordinance is approved. Thank you for your great work on this. Appreciate it. Moving right along, items 7D through 7F are the approval of contract and expenditure items as they appear on our agenda. 7D is an ordinance authorizing a consultant contract for the Far South Halsted Corridor Study. 7E is an ordinance authorizing a contract for the Regional Transit Economic Impact Assessment. And item 7F is approval of travel expenses reimbursement. Jill Leary is here, our Chief of Staff, to answer any questions that you may have on 7D and 7E. If there's no questions, how about a motion and a second to approve all of these ordinances in one vote? Director Andalcio moves, seconded by Director Carey, that we adopt item 7D through 7F. Is there leave for the attendance roll call on this? Seeing no objection, leave is granted, and those three, Madam Secretary, are approved. So let's move on to our perhaps most important part of the meeting today. And I thank you both, Laura and Aaron, for sitting through our working meeting, knowing how busy you are with the CMAP plan of action. So item 8 is a presentation on the CMAP plan of action for the regional transit or regional process. We all know as part, and Aaron Ailman and Laura Wilkinson are here to present your plan. First of all, thank you very much. You know, it's amazing. I think you already knew, but as we learned through Transit is the Answer in our daily work here, there are so many constituencies from top to bottom. So you have covered a lot of miles and a lot of meetings and literally thousands and thousands of hours. And we very much appreciate your hard work on this, and thank you for being here today. If you have a voice left from all the meetings that you've done, please, the floor is all yours. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Chairman Dillard. And I want to thank Leanne and her staff again for their partnership throughout this process. You know, we wouldn't have been able to expedite this process as effectively as we have without the work that you all have done on your strategic planning work. Transit is the answer. It really provided us with a sound foundation from which to jump into this requirement that was given to us by the General Assembly. So just as background for you all, we were asked to look at a variety of issues for the General Assembly, recognizing that there's a fiscal cliff impending, and deliver a report of recommendations to the General Assembly and the Governor's Office by January 1st, 2024. So we are on track to do so. Yesterday morning, our board and the MPO Policy Committee met, as Leanne mentioned. We had a healthy discussion on the recommendations that are in there, and really want to be here today to provide you with an update overview of that report document and provide you an opportunity again to weigh in, because we still are in the draft phase. Excuse me. Our hope is that we we're able to make some revisions to the document and to be responsive to our partners and get an approval in October. Next slide, please. So as we started this work, we were asked to be bold, to reimagine our transit system, to focus on making sure that this system that we have here is financially viable, that we're considering climate equity and economic growth across the region, and thinking about how we center the users of this system. And so over the past year, as mandated by the legislation, we convened a steering committee of civic, business, and labor leaders and academia to help advise the board and the MPO on best practices from across the country and across the nation. The outcome is really a 125-page report that has a variety of recommendations, but I like to start, and I think, again, this is just in partnership with the RTA here, and your perspective is that transit is about people, right? What you've heard this morning, it's about moving people who are riders and reducing congestion for non-riders. It's really making sure that our regional economic competitiveness is strong. That transit element is one of the reasons many businesses choose to locate in Northeastern Illinois. And we recognize through our long-range transportation plan that the climate and our climate goals will not be achieved if we don't have a strong transit system. And finally, as we look at the riders of transit, we do have high-income riders, but we also have low-income riders and low-income households that are overly dependent on transit. And we recognize that that allows for economic opportunity, for strong households, for continued growth and access to jobs, healthcare, educational opportunities as well. Next slide. So I probably don't have to tell you here, but we believe that the cost of inaction for funding our transit system is greater than the cost of action. You'll hear us talk about some tough choices that we are presenting to the General Assembly here, and none of the recommendations that I think we put forth haven't been heard before, but that we really fundamentally are funding the system on formulas that were based in the 1980s. Our economy has grown, it has changed, but recognizing that cuts to transit service of this scale would be devastating to the region, that we anticipate that a 20% cut to the annual operating costs could equate to a 30 to 40% service cuts, which would mean perhaps 100 cities across our region would no longer have access to Metra, 150 bus routes between PACE and CTA could be cut. And I'm not generally a Debbie Downer of a person, I'm a glass half full person, but again, this would be devastating to our economy here. Next slide. So let me turn it over to Laura to talk a little bit about how we developed the recommendations here.
Great, thank you. As Aaron mentioned, I think that the transit is the answer was an amazing jumping off point for us as we started this work. And I think you'll see a lot of what we recommend has a lot of overlap or extension of what is in the transit is the answer plan. When we began this and I first came to you, we discussed that we kind of are looking at this in three different buckets. The system that we want, how do we pay for it, and then how do we implement it? So when we come to, I won't spend as much time today on the system that we want, but I think it's also a very critical piece, and I don't want the time that we spend on it to equate to how important it is, because I think what we did is we took the next step of, if we're going to be asking for $700 million plus from the General Assembly, what is the transit system that we need today? And a lot of people have asked us over the year of us doing this, right? And again, they've asked the RTAs, what does transit look like now post-COVID? How do we look at the system in a new light? And so I think what we've tried to do in the system, what we want space of the report is really focus in on how do we get to the implementation of the things that we've been talking about. And so obviously the key one is focusing on the transit service itself, right? Really making sure that the system is reliable, that we bolster a service back to where it was, thinking about how do we expand the service, really rooting in the good work of the service agencies, but in making sure it expands and moves on into spaces throughout the region. A conversation we've been having in this region for a long time, making sure that we have fully integrated fares and affordable fares. We do talk about the need to raise fares, but also coupled with low income fare subsidies. So those things kind of go together in our recommendations. We all saw that bus service was the most reliable mode through the pandemic and also has the greatest ability to grow. And so we have recommendations that really enable that bus service to be faster and more reliable as we move through the years. We've heard a lot about safety and security concerns that we want to make sure that we addressed and took a respectful view of how do we make sure that we are bolstering the public confidence in the system. Again, back to that reliable transit service, how can we ensure that? But also thinking about things like transit ambassadors, two-way communications, technology, so that people feel comfortable in the system. We have recommendations that, again, kind of rebuilding that ridership base. Metro obviously having taken the largest hit, how do we make sure that we bolster their activities to move to regional rail? But also not, again, just for regional rail's sake, is that those communities that are along the line that have really built up and developed around those transit stations, that it really invests in those economic development pieces as well, which goes into that next piece of fostering transit supportive land use. We heard a lot through our outreach as well as in the steering committee, not only about ridership near transit stations, but really the employment workforce issues that are related to the transit. And making sure that we're working with the private sector as they look towards growth in different counties to make sure that we have access to employees to those development sites. And then last one, again, as you guys were talking about earlier today, how whether the different things that we need to be doing to invest in a universally accessible system, again, whether that's being able to move faster on some of our ADA accessibility or some of the paratransit improvements that our riders are looking for. So again, this is the only slide I'm going to spend on it today, but it's a good chunk of the report about how, if people are going to be investing in the system, how we not only support the system that we have, but we really look to improving the system going forward. Next slide. So the next piece of this is if we're going to make those improvements and we're going to add on to the system and we're going to look for those different improvements, how are we going to pay for it? So when we started to look at this, we looked at different packages and different scenarios of how you might be able to mix and match those different recommendations that we had in the system improvements. And then we really started talking like, if we don't really want to defeat ourselves, but really if we're talking about a system improvement that we want, we really should be looking at all of those system improvements. And so when we looked at that, we believe it's around $1.5 billion in revenue. So you'll see here as we started with the closing the gap that we've talked with your staff here about throughout the year, about $730 million estimate. And then to increase service and do those other activities, we're estimating it to be about 575, about 250 million for fare integration and all the other things we had in that bucket, about 145. So we're estimating that we really would be looking for 1.5 billion from the General Assembly in order to marry those two things together. The funding that we need in order to get the system that we want. It's important to recognize, because I don't think it's a small thing, that all of the packages that we looked at do have capital investments that are a part of that. And we know that's something we've been talking about for a long time, about the need to fund our state of good repair. So we didn't want to turn a blind eye that there are capital improvements that would be needed as part of this as well. So it's 1.5 and as we talk about state of good repair and capital investments. Next slide. So I think really a lot of the things that we heard in culmination, as Chair Dillard said, is, we have a lot of different audiences we've been talking to, a lot of different people with different perspectives. And so really being able to culminate around some different funding priorities was important to us. So the things that we learned and took into this report is that the transit system itself needed to be part of the solution and needed to bring options to the table about how we're going to improve this. That state support was going to be critical as we look towards funding. That stable and dedicated funding for paratransit was going to be extremely critical, especially as people the population and people are aging in place. We needed that growth was going to happen in the paratransit costs, and that we needed to make sure that that was fulfilled and that we support that, but also not continually drawing down on the rest of the services. The transportation revenues should be used for transportation investments. And so we really wanted to make sure we looked in that space. Very critical and part of the legislation itself is that there were co-benefits to equity and climate goals, not only of the transit systems, our region, but the entire state. And that we wanted to make sure that the revenues that we had really, sustainable buying power over time, so that we're not sitting here and doing this again in 10 years, that we're setting the entire system up for success. So next slide. So how we put our packages together is kind of in those buckets that I just talked about. System generated revenues, what is the system doing for itself? Baseline actions, what we're going to be asking from the state that needed to be in every scenario that we looked at. Durable sources, one again that are long-term and put us on a good path, but we also recognize some of those durable sources aren't things that are going to be able to be switched on by 2025, 26, and we know that that fiscal cliff is out there. So we also looked at what we would consider diminishing or stopgap sources that could be used in the interim. And lastly, capital sources, as I said, that we know that many of these packages would need funding as well on capital. So next slide. So as I said, we kind of put some different scenarios together, and we're spending most of our time and energy in the report really focused on that transformational investment, because again, we don't want to negotiate ourselves out of what the system is. So we are really focused on that $1.5 billion. And again, you can kind of see how that 1.5 is broken up. But in the next slide, I'll go through what each of those are. And for a moment before I get to that, I think one of the things when we talk about, go to the next slide. I was just getting ahead of myself. Is that when we think about those baseline actions, what we're asking from the state, again, is that full funding for the paratransit costs for our region. We know that we cover that cost entirely throughout this region. In the rest of the state actually pays a higher percentage, and most other states contribute a lot more to their paratransit or to their transit costs as well. So we kind of wanted to show that we know that the paratransit costs are growing, and that is something that the state can be at the table with us on those costs. So we are asking for state support of paratransit, full funding of paratransit for this region. In the next slide, we talk a little bit about why that even makes sense from a transit perspective, is that if you look at our peer states, other states pay more or contribute more to their transit systems than we do here in Illinois. So we do feel like it's valid to ask for additional funding from the state to be a partner with us at the table on funding this project. Next slide. So if you look at the different options that we were talking about, and you can hit it one more time, there's a little piece on the bottom that will come through. Go ahead and advance. There we go. Thank you. Sorry. As we discussed in those buckets, we're saying that yes, it's important that we raise fares, again, married with low income fare subsidies, and that we look at different savings and cost growth from the system itself. In those baseline actions, we talk about the paratransit and full funding of the reduced fares. As you guys were talking about earlier in the meeting, you've had many mandates about reducing fares that have not actually been funded. And so we want to make sure that you are made whole and putting those reduced fares together. And then you are charged a state surcharge. And so we want to make sure that we actually reduce that from the state as well, or eliminate that from the state for cost savings for the region. In our durable sources, we have a lot of information that we've put together and been very focused on about knowing that the raising of the sales tax has been where we have spent energies in the past to fund the transit system, and thinking about the future and it being sustainable. Well, that can be, again, a short-term or stopgap way to deal with this. We really have spent time and energy and will continue the dialogue about moving sales tax services within Illinois as that being a more durable source long-term, as we've seen goods go down and services go up in this economy, that if we're really looking to bolster the system in the long term, we're going to spend some time and energy on that in the durable sources. Again, extending the match to what the transit system receives. We kind of talk about the parking tax. We have it in this option. We talk a little bit about it being a stair step to things like cordon pricing, congestion pricing. So in a short term, this could be a first step towards moving towards different types of elements of funding the transit system. And again, using the vehicle registration fee, again, we talk about transportation funding for transportation investments. We also have some options for, again, diminishing or stopgap sources. So we're providing this in the package because many of these have discussed in the transit is the answer. We kind of put some different numbers to them and put some more quantitative information on there. But again, you'll see a lot of those match what you guys had already approved in transit is the answer. And so those are included in our package of funding pieces. Next slide. Again, we note that the capital investments are also needed. So depending on how many of the system improvement options the General Assembly moves forward with, there are different options to be able to fund those capital investment. Again, recognizing that we still have a lot of capital investment needs within the transit system as a whole. So those would probably need to be discussed as one package, but we think that we wanted to make sure that we put some options on the table about how we could fund those as well. And I'm going to hand it over to Erin to talk about how to implement.
Great. So we have a three-legged stool here, right? It's the system we want, and we've heard loud and clear, and I think you have heard loud and clear that the system we had in 2019 isn't the system that we want to go back to, that we want a better system, which is why you'll see in the how to pay for it section that Laura just covered, that there needs to be a big conversation in Springfield about the funding levels, and just filling the gap, I don't think is going to meet the needs of the stakeholders and the residents across our region. As I talk to counties, as I talk to municipalities across the region, as I talk to people across the region, nobody says they want less transit. They want more. And you all know that it costs something, which is why we're coming with a bold approach with a big number here, but recognizing that filling that gap doesn't get us any more than we had before, and we wanted to make sure that we have that strong transit system into the future. We were also asked to look at governance structures here as well. So if I could have the next slide. And as we thought about how to approach this for the report, we wanted to be clear that we weren't thinking about governance as reform as a way to fund the system overall, but that we wanted to think about governance in a way that helped our system make better decisions for the people of the region. And so there is a connection between how transit is governed and the system's overall effectiveness in delivering that user-centric system here. And thinking about the responsibility for financial stewardship of public resources, which is crucial when we're making the case for more investment here at the region. But we also recognize that governance in isolation isn't automatically going to address the challenges that we've seen post-COVID, these longstanding challenges, recognizing that travel demand has changed, and we don't think that people are going to be traveling in the same ways moving forward. So that, is one of those things that we don't expect governance to achieve that. So, we assess these reforms based on their ability to achieve the vision, the goals, and the actions described in the report, with a focus on improving how riders, taxpayers, and governments experience the system. And then we identified some governance recommendations that aren't governance for governance sake again, but really what they mean for the region. So we put together some performance metrics. Again, we recognize that the historical use of formulas has contributed to inflexible funding to our agencies and has created over time, maybe not right in this moment, but in past years, some detrimental competition between the agencies as well. And so as we ask for new funding, how can we make sure that the collaboration and the coordination continues to move forward? We talk about performance metrics, right? Really reducing the fare box recovery ratio requirement. We do think it's a good performance metric, but you all know that it's hard to build ridership up over time when you start a new service or when the agencies start a new service. So having that flexibility within the region to be able to control that, we think is also really important. Next slide. All right, so here again, we also looked at regional board appointments, again, thinking about how we will be asking the state for additional resources, that we should be thinking about what the role is for the state in the board appointments, to really think about those voting structures to advance that regional consensus building. Again, thinking about bringing more regional perspectives to the boards, the service boards, as well, and then thinking about the experience and expertise of the boards as part of our process for looking at the boards that exist today and what we might do or recommend into the future. Next slide. So we did evaluate a number of options. You'll see a couple at the bottom here. You know, like good planners, we do scenario planning. And so it was important for us to look at the broadest array of options of structural reform here. You'll see that, you know, minimizing the role of the RTA didn't solve our regional problems. That status quo, we thought, we heard from legislators, you know, wasn't necessarily meeting the needs of the day. We explored keeping the structures the same, but revising the funding allocations. But what we've landed on in this report and what you'll see recommended and embedded in the report are two options. One, that we strengthen the RTA and we keep the service boards, but we think about the things that transit service agencies provide, and maybe we need to readjust those boxes of activities to help support our system being more regional in nature. The other option that's in the report as well is integrating the service boards into one regional agency. I'll say this is a recommendation that's probably not new to you all. It was in the 2014 report. It was in the 2003 report. Again, both of these are longer term endeavors. And so we are starting the conversation today, but recognizing that there isn't a magic wand that I can wave to make this happen. And there would be more details necessary and research and support, and RTA, CTA, Metra, and PACE would necessarily need to be a part of those conversations. Next slide. We included in our presentation today just sort of a visual illustration of what this could look like. Again, a regional board with one executive director and one board here, that you would keep the service committees. We heard a lot from local stakeholders that their voices and having somebody to be responsive to about their service is really important. So you could think about this as having sort of service committees for Metra, CTA, PACE, and then we've heard from the counties too that paratransit voices, that they would like more paratransit voices at the table. So a service committee for paratransit and on-demand responsive services as well. But really, this is folding everything together into a single agency. The next slide depicts a strengthened and re-envisioned RTA. You know, right now you've got responsibility for capital funding and financial stewardship. But when we looked at other governing structures from across the country and around the world, you know, there's an opportunity, I think, if we had gone back and thought about the implementation of the Ventra system, right, that the fare policies being conducted at a regional level would be very impactful for the execution of that at the service boards. And so this would, this scenario looks at bringing that fare policy up to the regional entity, capital planning up to the regional entity, funding allocations and decision-making, right? That for new funding, that the regional entity should have a role in defining that and have the opportunity again to make those decisions. And then regional service planning, and that you would keep the CTA board, the Metro board, and the PACE boards, but you would consider, you know, some of the opportunities to refine the board seats. I think one example specifically is on the PACE board, there is one person who is a representative of the disability community, but that's 40% of their portfolio of work. That we should take a second look at the board representation at the agencies, but each agency would continue in this scenario to be responsible for HR and procurement and communications and labor negotiations. as again, so we do think there are opportunities for both of these options to be to help us achieve the goals of a regional transportation system that works better for everyone, and it reorients our system to be future focused and really thinking about how travel again has changed. That 60% of the jobs in our region can't be done from home. And so the fixed route systems that we have bringing people into the central business district, that we need to find ways to get people to the jobs that are out in the collar counties. And that's why we included a lot of recommendations about bus networks, because we do think that that is a very efficient way for us to consider the changing travel markets across our region. And so all of that connected in these options here. Next slide. So next steps. As you heard earlier, we had a healthy discussion, probably a 3-hour discussion yesterday, and a deep dive into many of the recommendations of the report. My board is made up of 5 members from Chicago, 5 from Cook, and 5 from the collar counties. The MPO policy committee includes all of the county board chairs and all of the transportation agencies, IDOT, CDOT, Metra, PACE, CTA, at the table talking about these. So we had a very healthy and robust discussion on these recommendations. Our goal is to bring back a revised version of the report for our October 11th joint meeting, and then to deliver this to the General Assembly and the Governor's office by their statutory deadline here. I think, you know, again, we did all that we could in a year. I recognize that that there may be a role for us to dig deeper and for you all to dig deeper into some of these issues and be those trusted advisors to our legislative leaders as they contemplate what they might do to fill this gap. So I do see us providing supportive legislative actions or research analysis moving forward. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time. I'm happy, Laura and I are happy to answer questions.
Thank you very, very much. Questions or comments? I know Aaron and Laura, some of the members of our board listened to your marathon meeting yesterday, which I appreciate. Director Carey.
Thank you for being here today. And I did listen to the meeting yesterday. I've taken a look at the report. First of all, it's a massive document and a massive amount of work went into it, and I appreciate that. I have a couple general questions or comments, I guess. Where we stand today as an RTA board, our biggest focus is on, I believe, trying to figure out how to get the funding so we don't, start to go down in the wrong direction in a couple of years. I worry a little bit, and I know the legislature asked you to look at governance too, and I think the governance is a very interesting conversation. And I certainly have personal opinions about that, but I worry a little bit about it getting muddled up, and that the funding part of it might, because at one point you said, if we're going to ask them for money, we have to show them that we can, we can handle it. And that might lead to governance changes. But if knowing how long governance conversations can take and how long Springfield can take, we can't necessarily wait that long on the funding. So I guess as clear as you could possibly be in your document, your resolution, that we really need, they can be parallel paths, and they should be, but the funding really kind of needs to move forward at a faster pace. And on the funding, I worry a little bit about putting them into buckets, option 1, option 2, that, I don't think the legislature would say, okay, well, we have to pick one or the other, but as opposed to a list of possibilities, kind of like we did in the transit is the answer, and what you might get out of each of those, and sort of the level of difficulty of getting it passed, et cetera, and what the value would be. Sure, there might be some interest in doing that. I think those are the 2 biggest things, and I'm pleased to hear you say you're going to provide a revised draft, because I think you got a lot of comments yesterday that you might need to soften some of it a little bit and structure it perhaps a little bit differently. Those are really the biggest things I had. Appreciate you listening.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. And you're right. I think we do need to be clear that the funding need is more near term but recognizing that these things can happen on parallel tracks is an important distinction. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Director Carey. Director Gavin.
Thank you for the, all the hard work you did into the report. I have a question about slide, page 4, I think it's slide 8 with the funding packages. Is that over a particular period of time, like that dollar amount
We would be looking for $1.5 billion annually
annually? Okay, thank you.
for the transit system.
Right. Dr. Slager.
I too want to thank you for the monumental job that you all have done in forwarding this set of recommendations and soliciting review from so many different facets of our society and community. So thank you very much. It is always a difficult thing, I think, when you are trying to look at funding and governance simultaneously. Certainly, there's no question about the fact that governance is an important area for review because it must be dynamic just as much as our larger system must be dynamic. And we have to be mindful of the fact that change is always an important element to moving forward. I too share Director Carey's concern that we can get lost in that because that becomes very, very, very political, as you are well aware. And so I think that we have to be cognizant of the fact that we've got to move forward on the financial aspect. And so I concur with my colleague that has indicated that. My concern with regards to the recommendation of packages, if you will, is that it could be perceived as presenting false dichotomies. It has to be one or the other. And in the inimitable style of our states, sometimes they want to have others wrestle with the difficult challenges and kind of say that, okay, you've done the work, and then we have a finger to point to, with all due respect to individuals who have been in the legislature in the past. But I do believe that putting forward just one or two packages does present that false dichotomy. It has to be one or it has to be the other. And I think we're all aware of the fact that there are huge opportunities out there that must be addressed, and they have to be addressed upon different aspects. They need to be addressed upon what is today's return versus future returns. What is the rapidity within which you can implement? What are the things that are going to bring about far-reaching benefits in terms of finances versus, okay, we can do that, but the return is pretty small. And so is it worth going through all that? And so I think that we really need to do a deep dive, if you will, because I think that's what the legislator is hoping we might be able to do, is to do a deep dive regarding the options that are there. And so I share Director Carey's concern a little bit about putting forth packages. Now, that's just one person's opinion, but I do believe that that could lead us down a difficult rabbit hole as we start to ask the legislature for bringing forward answers, frankly.
Yeah, thank you so much for your feedback. I think when we started this process, we've even continued on our path of revisions. We started with a third option, which would be just fill the gap. And I think we took that off the table immediately after talking with our transit agencies and with the staff here at the RTA, because that really isn't, I mean, yes, it's the immediate need, but in order to achieve these things, we shouldn't give them the lowest common denominator here. So with feedback, the continued feedback that we're receiving right now, we will take into consideration, you know, how we make sure that we don't create some false dichotomies here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, one more.
Yes, Director Payne.
I'm just gonna say the same thing, but thank you very much. This is I read it 2 times and I think all the directors here, we're you know, have to soak in this a little more. And I know we're running out of some time, and And I think governance is, I think it is time that we look at it, but you can't do it fast. It will be very, very hard. And I hope that in the media and in the region, that people don't grab on to something and it gets speed, because it's so important that it's very carefully done. I've done it in smaller places in the city of Chicago when I worked for Daily. It usually, luckily it would go back, because, it's just so hard. And I like that you started talking about human beings, people, and people do not change easily. And this is a system, if it's political, it's also scary to some people, exciting to others. So I just wanted to know, we're supposed to approve something. What are we approving?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that we've been contemplating this, right, is that the need is there, that the report provides a number of recommendations. When you break it down, if there were one thing that everybody was concerned about that I could take off the table to allay everyone's fears, I would, but from all of the voices across the region, there are many different things that people have valid concerns about, whether you're on the road side of things or you're on the transit side of things, or, the governance side of things. And so we are proposing that at the next meeting, we bring the entirety of the report, and that we're asking our board and our MPO members to approve a resolution of support authorizing this report of recommendations to go to the General Assembly. But we're talking about the importance of transit to our region, our economy, the climate. And so it's really fulfilling the mandates of the legislation in passing this forward, but that we aren't going to go into approval on every single recommendations, because I just don't think that is going to be possible for us to get through. So there will be a resolution. We presented a draft resolution at our board meeting yesterday. It was sent to all the members, and I imagine we'll get some feedback from many stakeholders as to how we can make that support stronger or more palatable for them.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess just my comments. First of all, again, thank you so much, and thank you for taking our input. And I know Leanne and our staff work with you and have throughout the years very, very well. I really thank you for pointing out that the fundamental challenge confronting the transit system in the state is the continued historic underfunding. When I got here, and having served in a number of capacities, I was sort of stunned at how well the system, my predecessors and others, have kept this system band-aided where there's never been a shutdown. Some other cities have had major issues, but my predecessors and others have done an amazing job with historic underfunding. On the slides you have today, the one that really jumps out at me is peer states contribute so much more to transit than Illinois. We're at 17% from Springfield, but places like Philadelphia are at 50%. And in Massachusetts, it's 44%. The baseline conclusion that you have in your path plan is the state has to step up on paratransit. In my first week as the chairman, we went out to Washington, D.C., and I remember meeting with the federal transportation administrators, and they said, because there was a rumor that Governor Rauner was going to cut paratransit funding. They said it's not a transportation issue. Paratransit's not a transportation issue. It's a civil rights issue. And there are court decisions and others, and the state may cut your paratransit funding, but the administrator pointed at me and said, but you have to fund it because it's a civil rights issue and it's been adjudicated in the courts. And then the other one, as a former legislator, Dr. Sager, that just fries me, and it's got to burn you too as a former mayor, is the state started to charge us a surcharge for collecting sales taxes, which is the Illinois Department of Revenue's job, and they already have that data. So the baseline, everything we start with, Aaron and Laura, when we're in Springfield, is we've just got to make the legislature assume they're going to fully fund paratransit, and they're going to get rid of that surcharge for transit for a job that the state already does. And then last but not least, and this goes back, and I was in the legislature when Governor Blagojevich really wanted to expand, but we spend hundreds of millions of dollars today on free rides. And there is no free ride, as my father taught me when I was 8 years old. So the legislature needs to fund these programs. The other thing that I know makes my blood boil is that people say we have low ridership. We have lower ridership or reduced ridership from COVID. But last week, 2 days, we were moving over 1.2 million riders a day. That's a tenth of the state's population. So we're moving more than 1 million riders a day. So while we have lower ridership, it's not low ridership. It's still critical to this state's economy and the region for so many reasons. I really appreciate the fact that you have a couple of slides, because one of the things I worry about at night is just making sure the system works. We heard Violet's presentation today, and it's amazing to me how fast and rapidly the CTA actually can go from the medical center district, over to LaSalle and others eastward on capital improvements. But we have to continue to remember we do have an operator, while the focus is on operations a lot here, we do have a capital need of state of good repair that Dr. Sager, got to remind my friends, my former colleagues, and the governor that we still have capital needs. We still have a massive state of good repair. While we're talking about operations, we can't take the eye off of the capital needs that we still have. On governance, as I looked at what other states have done, and I just dug down in California yesterday again, really none of the other states have made changes in governance for the reasons that Director Carey and Dr. Sager pointed out, is that when you get mired in governance changes, you may lose the legislature's ability and the public's to keep their eye on what is really needed, which is our problem is historic underfunding of the system. And I think our system here, it's not perfect, but it's worked well. We're Solomon on this board. We balance the regional needs pretty well. There's never been a shutdown of this system. We've just got a reinforcement of our AA+ credit rating. The pension systems that are Metra, PACE, and our own are essentially around 90% funded. It's one of the reasons we keep that AA+ credit rating. Our operating costs are among the lowest in the country. And even with Chicago winters, labor, and older equipment, our breakdowns, as we were shown today, mechanical breakdowns per mile, are among the lowest, and it's a tribute to our mechanics and our labor force. But generally, things have run fairly well. In addressing governance without addressing, as it's been pointed out, the structural shortfalls here, we gotta have this discussion together. And I just worry that discussions sometimes on governance will make the legislature take its eye off the ball, which is the historic underfunding of the system. Although I've told everybody, including the Senate president and then the speaker and legislative leaders, I believe that the current governance structure can produce the kinds of outcomes we all want. And it's we all want these. The RTA would welcome and take any additional powers that either, CMAP or the legislative leaders give us. And as I think we've done, we'll do a good job with those additional powers. But, the discussions will continue. it comes down to really the legislature, I guess, but the four leaders in the legislature are pretty engaged here. As Rob Nash has pointed out, we've seen them all multiple times. They have provided valuable input to us and to CMAP. I can't thank you enough for taking on this project that was handed to you or mandated to you by the General Assembly. And we haven't had the last of the discussions, but your report is so welcomed, and we really appreciate. So it's just not the RTA that's out there singing these things. And let me tell you, I agree with basically everything you're doing. So look forward to continuing to partner into the spring when we come to a resolution for the future of transit ridership in northeastern Illinois. So thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate your partnership and we look forward to continuing to work with you all. Thank you so much.
I have one more question.
Yes, Director Payne.
Hearings in Springfield, what's planned?
Yeah, so we've been, we'll want to get to the adoption. I think that's a first step before we do anything. And again, we meet with your team here as well as the team and all the service boards so that we can remain coordinated. I think, again, we were saying we've spent a lot of time getting back down to the weeds, and then we're gonna have to start again at the top of this of like why transit's important, where we started. And I think that's like the first step too of like making sure all of those messages are together. We do, once this is adopted, expect that there will be some legislative hearings from the or briefings, not hearings, briefings on the report. We don't have anything locked in right now. We want to make sure we get through the adoption. We're not expecting that there'll be any action taken at veto this year. So we're talking about, in the next cycle, just for, again, continued briefings on what's included. So just like we've done here, want to make sure that we're sharing and explaining what the report is. So those will happen in the future.
Thank you and great work.
Thank you. All right. I think that concludes our business other than new business for today. Yes, Director Colson.
Just briefly, Metra is contemplating what on my area at least appear to be rather draconian changes to the way that their tickets will be sold beginning next year. And they appear frankly to many people in my area to be not only inequitable, but they could have a negative impact on ridership and fare revenue. And so I hope, and I'm requesting that as we go through the budget process, that at some point Metra will try to explain these proposed changes and why they're necessary. I think that would be very helpful to the people who live in my area who are very concerned.
Yeah, I'll just quickly respond. And Director Colson and I have talked a couple of times about this, and I know he has talked directly with Metra, and we can certainly keep that as a sort of a focus element within the budget approval process. And Metra has to do all its public input and hearings and all of that as well. And then we can share with you additional information on the work that they're doing and their explanation of it, but we will certainly incorporate it as a featured item within the budget work.
I agree. I'm one of those, you're going to take away my 10 ride. All right. Having it used to be a monthly, now it's a 10 ride because I'm part of the new economy. So it's a 10 ride, not a monthly like I had for 20 plus years. So, but we hear you, Bill, and we will stay focused on that. Any other new business to come before the Board of Directors of the Northeastern Illinois Regional Transportation System? Seeing none, Dr. Sager moves, we adjourn, seconded by Director Fuentes. All those in favor signify by leaving. We are adjourned. Thank you.